I already paid.
Let go.
Grace Colton's yellow-gloved hand closed around Nadia Bennett's tray and yanked it across the cafeteria counter.
Go to the assistance section.
Grace did not scan it.
There is no assistance section.
Marcus Bennett had entered to surprise his daughter after 3 weeks away. He was still holding the leather case containing a $12.5 million donation agreement for the school.
What happened here?
This is a student matter.
Where is that rule written?
Leave through the service exit. Dad, please don't tell her who you are.
All right.
Grace called security. Then, in front of dozens of raised phones,
Search his bag.
On what grounds?
she grabbed his case and tore it open. A family photograph struck the floor.
You have no right to take that.
Stop touching his things.
A brass token from his dead brother spun beneath her shoe. And the donation papers bearing his late wife's name slid through spilled soup.
Anyone can print impressive documents.
We are just beginning.
But Grace had already made one final choice, and the doors behind her were beginning to open. The cafeteria at Ashwood College was loud enough to hide almost anything. Forks scraped plates, chairs dragged across tile. Students talked over the soda machine and trays moving along the steel counter. That was why only a few people noticed the yellow rubber glove close around Nadia Bennett's lunch tray. Nadia held on. Grace Colton pulled harder. The tray jerked between them. Soup spilled across the white plastic. "Let go," Grace said. Her badge read Cafeteria Operations Supervisor, 19 years of service. "I already paid," Nadia answered. Grace gave a dry laugh. "You people always say that after the fact." She did not shout. Humiliation worked better when spoken like a rule everyone else had accepted. Nadia released the tray. Grace laid it beside the waste bin. "I have a full meal plan." Nadia took out her student card. Her fingers were steady. Although her jaw had tightened, Grace did not scan it. "Go to the assistance section." "There is no assistance section." Professor Evelyn Hart stopped stirring her coffee. Grace pointed toward tables beside the service doors. "You know where I mean." 4 students sat there with smaller paper plates. All 4 were black or brown. No sign marked the area. No written rule created it. Still, everyone sent there understood. Nadia held up her card. "My tuition and meal plan are fully paid. Please scan it." Grace leaned closer. "You should be grateful. This school gives students like you a place at all." The sentence reached the glass entrance just as Marcus Bennett walked inside. He had been speaking to a trustee. "Tell President Ashwood, Alsace, once legal approves the final language." Marcus was saying, then he heard Grace, "Students, like you." Marcus stopped mid-sentence. He stood near the doors without a tie, his charcoal blazer open, a worn leather case in one hand. He looked less like the businessman whose name had filled the boardroom and more like a tired father arriving for lunch. His eyes found Nadia. She stood perfectly still. Marcus knew that stillness. She had inherited it from her mother, Michelle, who became quiet when hurt because she feared the truth might wound someone else. For 3 weeks, Nadia had told him college was fine. Her classes were demanding. Her roommate snored. The library closed too early on Fridays. She had mentioned everything except Grace. Grace took the card, turned it over once, and dropped it onto the wet counter. "Now stop performing for everyone." Something settled inside Marcus, not rage. Rage was fast. This was slower. It was the look of a man placing each detail in order before deciding what it required. He crossed the cafeteria. The trustee called his name, but Marcus did not turn. Students beside. Jordan Price, a journalism student, raised his phone. Marcus stopped beside Nadia. A soup stain marked her sweater. Her student card lay in a puddle. He set down his leather case, picked up the card, wiped it with a napkin, and placed it back in her hand. Only then did he rest his palm on her shoulder. The touch said she was not standing alone anymore. Grace folded her arms. "Can I help you?"
I'd like you to explain what just happened.
Grace looked him over. No tie, no visitor badge, no expensive watch beneath his sleeve. She saw only a black man asking questions in a place where she believed questions belonged to her. "This is a student matter. You need to leave. I'm her father." Then teach her to follow rules instead of creating a spectacle. Nadia's breathing changed beneath Marcus's hand. He looked toward the tables near the service doors. "What rule?" "The rule I have enforced here for 19 years. "Where is it written?" Grace hesitated, then her expression hardened. "I do not have to justify school policy to a man who walked in off the street." A murmur passed through the room. Marcus did not raise his voice. "May I have your full name and position?" Grace stepped away from the counter. Nadia reached for Marcus's wrist. Her fingers closed around it with sudden urgency. "Dad," she whispered. Marcus looked down. There was fear in her eyes, but it was not fear of Grace. It was fear of what would happen once the truth entered the room. "Please," Nadia said, "don't tell her who you are." Marcus looked at his daughter's hand around his wrist. She was not asking him to stay silent because Grace deserved protection. She was asking because Nadia had spent her entire life fighting a shadow she had never chosen. Marcus Bennett's name opened doors before she reached them. It made admissions officers smile too quickly. It made professors pause when they read her surname. It made strangers assume that every good grade, every internship, every opportunity had arrived in an envelope with her father's signature at the bottom. Nadia wanted one place where she was simply Nadia, not the daughter of a billionaire, not the child of a famous medical innovator, not the young woman whose tuition could have been paid 1,000 times over, just Nadia. Marcus understood that. What he did not understand was how much she had endured to preserve it. "All right," he said softly. "I won't tell her." Grace mistook his answer for surrender. "Good. Then take your daughter and leave before I call security." Marcus turned his attention back to her. "I said I wouldn't tell you who I am. I didn't say I was leaving." The low conversation around them thinned. Grace's mouth tightened. Professor Hart lowered her coffee cup. Jordan kept his phone raised, though his hand had begun to tremble. Marcus slipped one hand into his trouser pocket. His thumb found the worn edge of a brass transit token. He had carried it so long that touching it had become instinct. Some people carried photographs. Some wore wedding rings long after the person they loved was gone. Marcus carried a piece of old Baltimore transit metal that had not been valid currency in decades. Malik had given it to him on a January night when the apartment windows shook from wind. Marcus had been 8. Malik was 12. Their mother had spread 2 school books across the kitchen table because the heater in the bedroom had failed again. Their father was working a double shift repairing city buses. Outside, sirens moved through West Baltimore. Inside, Malik was explaining the circulatory system with a red crayon and the back of an overdue electric bill. "The heart is a pump," he had said, "but it's not the only thing keeping you alive." "What else?" "People paying attention." Malik had smiled when he said it. 6 months later, bruises appeared along his arms. The first clinic called them growing pains. Another doctor said he was tired. By the time someone ordered the right blood test, the word leukemia had already entered the family like smoke under a door. Malik never reached 13. On one of his final hospital mornings, he pressed the transit token into Marcus's palm. "You're going somewhere," he whispered. Marcus had tried to give it back. Malik closed his fingers over it. "Use it for both of us." The token followed Marcus everywhere after that, through military barracks where he learned to sleep beside noise, through night classes where he worked until his vision blurred through a scholarship interview in Sisi. At MIT's, where one professor asked whether he was certain he belonged in biomedical engineering. Through the first laboratory, he rented inside a converted garage that smelled of dust, solder, and burnt coffee. Through every failure, through every patent rejection, through every year spent building a company devoted to finding childhood diseases earlier, before another family heard the words "too late." Then came Michelle. She was the first person who understood that Marcus's ambition was not hunger for success. It was grief wearing work clothes. She never tried to remove the token from his pocket. She only had 3 tiny letters engraved along its rim: M for Malik, M for Michelle, N for Nadia. Marcus rubbed his thumb over the final letter now. Nadia stood beside him with soup drying against her sleeve. He had built machines capable of detecting abnormalities hidden inside a drop of blood. Yet he had failed to detect what was happening to his own child. That truth hurt more than Grace's contempt. Marcus lowered his voice. "How long?" Nadia looked toward the floor. "How long has she been doing this?" Grace interrupted. "I'm standing right here." Marcus did not look at her. Nadia. His daughter's shoulders lifted with one shallow breath. "The first week, she said my card wasn't active." "Was it?" "Yes, the second time. She said the full meals were for students who paid the standard rate." "You paid the standard rate." "I know." Marcus waited. Nadia swallowed. "She started sending me to those tables after she saw me eating with Tasha and Luis." Marcus glanced toward the rear of the cafeteria. "And after that?" "She would change things in the system. Sometimes my meals showed as already used. Sometimes it said scholarship restriction. Sometimes she said there wasn't enough food left." "How many times?" Nadia pressed her lips together. "Enough. That isn't a number. I don't know." Marcus knew when she was protecting him. She had done it after Michelle died. At 14, Nadia had learned to hide her crying behind running water because she could hear Marcus walking the hallway at night, already carrying more grief than one person should. She had started packing her own lunches, signing her own school forms, saying she was fine before anyone asked. Marcus had admired her strength without seeing its cost. "Why didn't you tell me?" Nadia finally looked at him. "Because you would do exactly what you're doing now. Standing beside you, turning it into something you have to fix." Her words landed without cruelty. That made them harder to hear. "You already lost Mom," she said. "You already spend your life trying to stop other families from losing people. I didn't want to become another emergency." Marcus's hand fell from her shoulder. For one moment, the cafeteria disappeared. There was only his daughter standing in front of him, believing that her pain had to become small so his could remain survivable. If you have ever hidden your own hurt because you thought silence would protect someone you loved, stay with Nadia's story. Sometimes the burden we conceal does not disappear. It simply teaches us how to suffer without witnesses. Marcus looked at Grace again. His voice remained calm. "Did you know she had asked for help before today?" Grace gave a short laugh. "She complained because she doesn't like being told no." Marcus turned back to Nadia. "How many times?" he asked once more. Nadia's eyes filled, but she did not let the tears fall. "Enough times that I stopped counting." At that exact moment, Grace reached beneath the counter and pressed the security button. The security button beneath Grace's counter made no sound. That was the point. One press sent an alert to the campus safety office without disturbing the room. Grace had used it often enough that her hand moved without hesitation. Marcus noticed the movement, so did Professor Hart. Neither said anything yet. Nadia bent to pick up her card from the counter, but Grace placed 2 gloved fingers over it. "This stays with me until the matter is reviewed." "You cannot confiscate my student identification," Nadia said. "I can when there is suspected misuse." "What misuse?" Grace turned the card toward herself as though studying evidence. You claim to have benefits that do not appear in my system. They appeared yesterday. Then perhaps you should ask yourself why that changed. Nadia stared at her. That sentence confirmed something she had suspected for weeks. The problems were not random. The first incident had happened on September 9th, a Monday. Nadia remembered because rain had soaked the cuffs of her jeans, and the cafeteria smelled of tomato soup and wet coats. She had scanned her card. A red notice appeared. Meal already claimed. Nadia had laughed at first, thinking the machine had made a mistake. Grace had not laughed. Young lady, trying twice does not make the second meal free. I haven't eaten today. That is what they all say. Grace had eventually handed her an apple and a packet of crackers, then pointed toward the rear tables. Nadia told herself it was a software error. The next Thursday, her account showed a scholarship restriction. The week after that, Grace said Nadia's plan covered breakfast, but not lunch. Then the system claimed she had purchased 3 meals within 20 minutes. Each time, Nadia visited student accounts. Each time, an employee confirmed that her plan was unrestricted. Each time, the problem vanished by the following morning. And each time, Nadia returned to the cafeteria. Grace looked at her as though she had escaped a punishment rather than corrected a mistake. Nadia began taking photographs. She photographed the error messages. She saved digital receipts. She wrote down dates, times, and the names of students standing nearby. At first, she thought she was gathering enough information to defend herself. Then, she noticed Tasha Green being told the grilled chicken was unavailable while the student behind her received it. She saw Luis Mendoza's card marked as financial assistance, even though he worked 2 jobs to pay full tuition. She watched Grace remove a yogurt and bottled juice from Caleb Ford's tray because his plan supposedly allowed only basic nutrition. There was no basic nutrition category. Nadia checked. She searched the student handbook, the dining agreement, the financial aid policies, and every update posted on the school portal. Nothing mentioned separate tables. Nothing allowed cafeteria employees to identify scholarship students publicly. Nothing gave Grace authority to downgrade meals. The rules existed only when Grace spoke them. And somehow, they always seemed to apply to the same kinds of students. Jordan Price had noticed too. 2 weeks earlier, he had been sitting near the window when Grace stopped Tasha and asked to see proof that she lived on campus. Tasha had produced a room key. Grace asked for a second form of identification. Jordan wrote the exchange in the Notes app on his phone. He did not record it. The year before, he had filmed a professor insulting a custodial worker during a faculty event. An administrator warned him that publishing the footage without context could damage innocent careers. Jordan deleted the video. The professor kept his position. The custodian. Since then, Jordan had carried the shame of knowing that evidence could disappear with one tap of a screen. This time, he kept recording. His phones captured Grace's hand over Nadia's identification card. It captured the wet soup stain on Nadia's sweater. It captured Marcus standing beside his daughter without shouting, threatening, or moving toward Grace. Professor Hart watched from 11 feet away. For 8 years, she had submitted concerns about the cafeteria. Students had described unequal portions, suspicious account changes, and public accusations. The complaints were always acknowledged politely. Then they vanished. One was classified as a misunderstanding. Another was closed because the student graduated. A third was returned to Professor Hart with a note recommending informal resolution. She had preserved copies inside a blue soul folder in Everfoss. For years, she told herself that keeping records was a form of resistance. Watching Nadia now, she understood that documentation without action could become another shape of silence. Marcus looked at the students seated near the service doors. "Who told you to sit there?" he asked. No one answered at first. Then Luis raised his hand slightly. She did. Grace turned toward him. "You were assigned there because of repeated meal plan confusion. My account has never been restricted. That is not what the system shows." Luis took out his phone. "I have the email from student accounts." Tasha stood beside him. "So do I." Another student lifted her card. "She changed mine last month." The cafeteria began to shift, not loudly. Students stopped eating. Heads turned. Phones rose from tables. Grace looked around and saw the thing she feared most: not disorder, witnesses. "These students do not understand administrative procedure," she said. Nadia reached into her backpack. She removed a slim black notebook. Marcus had never seen it before. Inside were dates, meal numbers, receipt codes, short descriptions, and initials. Grace's name appeared again and again. "I understand enough," Nadia said. "I checked every policy you cited." Grace stared at the notebook. "You have been documenting employees without authorization?" "I have been documenting what happened to me. That material is school property if it involves our systems." "No," Jordan said from across the room. "It isn't." Grace's head snapped toward him. "Put that phone down." Jordan's hand trembled harder. He kept filming. Nadia opened the notebook to a page marked with a folded receipt. "There is no assistance section. There is no restricted seating policy. And there is no rule allowing you to change a student's meal category." Grace's face lost color. Only for a moment, then she pointed toward Marcus. "This man entered a secure student facility, disrupted operations, and encouraged a crowd." Marcus glanced toward the doors. Two uniformed campus security officers has appeared behind the glass. Grace straightened her apron. Her confidence returned before they even stepped inside. She believed uniforms would restore the version of the story she controlled. Professor Hart quietly closed her coffee cup, stood, and walked toward the side exit. No one tried to stop her. By the time the security officers reached Marcus, she was already in the hallway, dialing the private number of President Edward Ashwood. The first security officer entered with one hand resting near his radio. The second followed 2 steps behind. Neither looked older than 30. Grace pointed at Marcus before they could ask a question. "That is the man. He entered without authorization, refused to leave, and became confrontational when I enforced student policy." Marcus remained beside Nadia. His hands were visible. His voice was level. "I have not threatened anyone." Jordan's phone recorded the distance between them, nearly 6 feet. No raised fist, no sudden movement, no sign of aggression. Only a father standing next to his daughter. The taller officer looked at Grace. "Did he touch you?" "No, but aggression is not always physical. What exactly did he do?" "He challenged me in front of students." The officer glanced at Marcus. "That is not a security violation." Grace's expression changed. She had called for uniforms expecting obedience, not questions. "This is a restricted facility." The officer looked toward the wide glass entrance, where students were still walking in with backpacks and lunch trays. "Sir, may I see identification?" Marcus reached slowly into the inner pocket of his blazer. Grace took one step back, as though the movement proved her warning. Marcus removed his wallet and handed over his driver's license. The officer studied it. Marcus Bennett. Grace gave a dismissive sound. "A name proves nothing." The officer returned the license. "His identification is valid. He could still be here under false pretenses." "I told you," Nadia said. "He is my father." Grace's eyes moved between them. There was resemblance if anyone cared to look. The same steady gaze. The same slight tension in the jaw when emotion had to be controlled. But Grace had already chosen her version of them. To abandon it now would mean admitting she had been wrong in front of everyone. People often cling hardest to a lie after witnesses arrive, not because the lie becomes more convincing, because humiliation makes truth feels like defeat. Grace pointed at Marcus's leather case. "Search that." The shorter officer frowned. On what grounds? He brought an unverified bag into a student dining facility. So did half the people in this room. That one is different. The words remained between them. Marcus looked at the officer. "I do not consent to a search." Grace moved before anyone could stop her. She grabbed the shoulder strap. Marcus held the handle. For one brief second, the leather case stretched between them. "Let go," Grace said. "You have no right to take that. I have a duty to protect these students." Nadia stepped forward. "Stop touching his things." Grace pulled harder. The metal clasp snapped open. The case struck the edge of the counter. Everything inside spilled across the tile. A black fountain pen, a pair of reading glasses, 2 legal folders, a photograph in a worn silver frame, and one brass transit token. The token hit the floor with a sharp metallic ring. It spun in a tight circle beneath the fluorescent lights. The sound was small, yet Marcus heard it above every whisper in the cafeteria. For an instant, he was back in a hospital room in Baltimore. Malik's thin fingers were closing around his hand. "Use it for both of us." The token wobbled, rolled several feet, and came to rest beside Grace's shoe. Marcus stared at it. Grace looked down but did not bend to pick it up. Instead, she reached for one of the folders. Across the cover, embossed in dark blue letters, were the words, "Michelle Bennett Student Health and Opportunity Initiative." Nadia saw her mother's name. Her face tightened. Grace opened the folder. The first page described a proposed $12.5 million commitment for student medical screenings, emergency grants, dining support, and scholarships. Marcus had spent 14 months designing the program. Michelle had once told him that the cruelest emergencies were not always dramatic. Sometimes they were a student pretending not to be hungry. Sometimes they were a mother choosing between rent and medicine. Sometimes they were a child saying everything was fine because the adults already looked tired. The initiative was meant to carry her name into rooms where someone needed help before asking became unbearable. Grace scanned the first page. She did not read far enough to understand it. She looked at Marcus and laughed once. "Anyone can print a proposal." Then she dropped the folder. The pages scattered through spilled soup. Nadia inhaled sharply. Marcus did not move. Grace picked up the framed photograph. Michelle stood between Marcus and Nadia at a summer picnic, her curls lifted by wind, one hand pressed against her daughter's cheek. It was the last family photograph taken before the aneurysm. Grace glanced at it and tossed it onto the open case. The frame landed face down. Something inside Nadia changed. Marcus saw it happen. Until then, she had been embarrassed. Now she was angry, not loud anger. The kind that clarifies. Grace stepped between them. She spread both arms as though protecting Nadia from her own father. "For the safety of the students, you will remain separated until this matter is resolved." Nadia stared at her. "You are not protecting me. You are too young to understand what is happening." "I understand exactly what is happening." Grace turned her attention to the security officers. "Escort him through the service exit. We do not need more disruption." Marcus bent and picked up the photograph. He wiped the edge of the frame with his sleeve. Then he collected the wet pages one at a time. No one spoke. Even Grace seemed unsettled by the patience of it. Nadia knelt beside him. She reached beneath a chair and found the brass token. When she placed it in Marcus's palm, her fingers remained there for a moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Marcus closed his hand around the token. "You have nothing to apologize for." Grace heard him. She folded her arms again. That attitude is exactly the problem. Your daughter has received opportunities other students would be grateful for, yet she behaves as though this institution owes her special treatment. Marcus stood. What special treatment did she ask for? A full meal, preferred seating, exceptions. She asked to receive what was already paid for. Grace shook her head. Students like her need to learn gratitude. The words struck harder than the tray. Nadia's anger faltered. For a second, she looked 19 again. Not an investigator, not the daughter of anyone important. Just a young woman discovering that effort and politeness could still be treated as permission to degrade her. Marcus watched that realization settle across her face. Then he looked at Grace. You have had several chances to correct yourself. I have nothing to correct. Marcus removed his phone. Grace smiled, as if expecting him to call a lawyer after being removed. He opened a secure message thread and typed 6 words to his chief counsel. Freeze all Ashwood agreements immediately. He pressed send. Then he opened a second conversation. President Ashwood, Cafeteria. Come down now. Marcus placed the phone back in his pocket. Grace pointed toward the service doors. We are done here. Marcus looked past her toward the main entrance. No, he said quietly.
We are just beginning.
President Edward Ashwood was still upstairs when the message reached him. He stood at the head of the boardroom table beneath a portrait of his grandfather, the man who had founded the college 72 years earlier. Around him sat trustees, attorneys, and advancement officers waiting for Marcus Bennett's signature. The agreement rested beneath a silver pen. $12.5 million, the largest private commitment in Ashwood College history. Edward had spent 6 months preparing for that morning. He had reviewed every phrase in the donor presentation, approved the flowers in the lobby, and instructed staff to address Marcus by title, even though Marcus had repeatedly asked them not to. Then his phone vibrated. President Ashwood. Cafeteria. Come down now. A second notification appeared before Edward could respond. Bennett Foundation negotiations suspended pending immediate review. His mouth went dry. One trustee leaned toward him. Is there a problem? Edward looked again at the name on the screen. Marcus Bennett. The man who had left the room 20 minutes earlier, saying he wanted to surprise his daughter with lunch. Edward pushed back his chair. Excuse me. He did not wait for the elevator. He took the stairs. By the time he reached the ground floor, Professor Evelyn Hart was waiting beside the cafeteria entrance. She held her phone in one hand and a blue folder against her chest. Edward, she said. He heard something in her voice that made him stop. What happened? You need to see it before anyone explains it away. She opened the door. The cafeteria looked less like a dining hall than a room holding its breath. Students stood beside tables. Phones were raised. 2 security officers remained near the counter. Grace Colton blocked the service exit. Marcus stood several feet away, holding a damaged photograph frame in one hand and a wet legal folder in the other. Nadia stood beside him. There was soup on her sweater. Edward recognized Marcus immediately. His face changed before he could control it. Mr. Bennett. Grace turned. Relief crossed her features. President Ashwood, thank goodness. This man has refused to leave, interfered with operations, and encouraged students to challenge staff. Edward barely heard her. His eyes moved to the papers on the floor. Michelle Bennett's name was visible across one soaked page. He looked at Marcus. What happened? Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Nadia. This is my daughter. Edward followed his gaze. He had met Nadia once during orientation, though he had not realized who she was. Marcus had asked that her application, admission, and student experience remain separate from all donation discussions. Nadia had earned her place. That had been one of Marcus's conditions from the beginning. Edward stared at the stain on her sweater. Grace looked between them. "Your daughter?" Marcus said nothing. Edward took one careful breath. Then he turned toward the students. "This is Marcus Bennett." The room remained quiet. Edward continued because there was no safe way to stop. "He is the founder and chief executive of Bennett Pediatric Diagnostics." A whisper moved through the cafeteria. Jordan's phone stayed fixed on them. Edward's voice tightened. "His company is currently valued at approximately $4.2 billion. He is also the donor behind the proposed Michelle Bennett Student Health and Opportunity Initiative." Grace's arms slowly lowered. Edward looked at the wet folder. "The initiative includes $12.5 million in medical screening, emergency support, dining assistance, and scholarships." Grace gripped the counter. Her eyes moved toward Marcus as though his face had changed. It had not. Only the information around him had. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice suddenly smaller, "there has clearly been a misunderstanding." Marcus looked at her. "Which part?" Grace swallowed. "I was following procedure." "The procedure you could not produce?" "I did not resize the student was your daughter." That sentence wounded her more than any accusation could have. Marcus's expression did not change. That should not have mattered. Grace looked toward Edward. "I would never knowingly treat an important family this way." Marcus took one step forward. "Important family?" The words were soft, but they carried to every table. "What did you believe she was before you knew my name?" Grace opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Marcus held up Nadia's student card. She was enrolled. He lifted the damaged folder. Her meal plan was paid. Then he pointed toward the tables by the service doors. "And the students you placed there were human beings before anyone checked their bank accounts." Grace's face reddened. "I have served this institution for 19 years. Then you had 19 years to learn that." A few students began to clap. The sound started hesitantly, one pair of hands, then another. Marcus raised his palm. The applause stopped. He did not want a performance. He wanted answers. President Ashwood moved closer to Grace. "Did you create a separate seating area?" "No." Nadia stepped forward. "Yes, she did." Grace turned sharply. "You need to be very careful." Nadia met her eyes. "I have been careful." She opened the black notebook. September 9th. My account showed a meal already used. September 12th. Scholarship restriction. September 18th. Breakfast only plan. September 23rd. Meal access suspended. She turned several pages. Tasha Green, Luis Mendoza, Aaron Bell, Simone Carter, Caleb Ford. Grace's face tightened at the last name. Nadia noticed. "So you remember him?" "I remember hundreds of students. You accused him of stealing food. He was unable to verify payment. He had a receipt." Grace looked toward Edward. "This is becoming a public trial." "No," Nadia said. "This is the first time anyone has listened." Professor Hart walked forward. She placed the blue folder on a nearby table. "I submitted concerns about Miss Colton 8 years ago." Edward looked at her. "Evelyn. Then again 6 years ago, 4 years ago, last spring." She opened the folder. Copies of emails, complaint forms, and handwritten student statements filled it. "I was told each matter had been resolved." Edward stared at the documents. Grace's confidence began to fracture. "These are disgruntled students." Jordan spoke from behind his phone. "Then why did you tell all of them the same non-existent rule?" Grace pointed at him. "Stop filming." Jordan did not move. No, it was the first time he had said the word without apology. Marcus looked at Nadia. "You said you documented this." She nodded. "Receipts, screenshots, dates, names. Are you willing to submit them?" Nadia glanced around the cafeteria. A dozen students were watching her. Some looked hopeful. Others looked frightened by what hope might cost. "Yes," she said. but only if everyone else is protected too. Marcus's expression softened. That was the moment the story stopped belonging only to him. His power had opened the door. Nadia was deciding what would walk through it. Edward cleared his throat. Grace Colton, effective immediately. You are suspended pending an independent investigation. Grace stared at him. You cannot do this to me. I can, and I am. After 19 years? Edward looked at the phones recording him. After what occurred here today. Grace untied her apron. Her hands shook as she folded it. For the first time since Marcus entered, she seemed to understand that authority could disappear as quickly as dignity had been taken from others. She placed the apron on the counter. Then Jordan's phone buzzed. One notification became 10. Then 20. He looked down at the video he had uploaded less than a minute earlier. Former students were already commenting. I know that voice. She did the same thing to me. Ask what happened to Caleb Ford. Jordan raised his eyes toward Nadia. This is bigger than today, he said. And somewhere across the city, a mother named Angela Ford was about to see Grace Colton's yellow gloves on her phone screen and recognized the hand that had helped drive her sons out of Ashwood College. Angela Ford was standing over a sink full of dishes when Jordan's video reached her phone. The clip had already been shared thousands of times. At first, she watched without sound, a crowded cafeteria. A young black woman with soup on her sweater. A man standing beside her. Then Grace Colton's hand entered the frame. Yellow rubber glove. 2 fingers pressed against a student card. Angela stopped breathing. She turned up the volume. Grace's voice filled the kitchen. Students like her need to learn gratitude. The plate in Angela's hand slipped into the sink. It did not break. The sound still brought Caleb from the hallway. You all right? Angela looked at her son. He was 21 now, taller than his father had been, with oil beneath his fingernails from the repair shop where he worked 6 days a week. For 2 years, he had refused to say Grace Colton's name. Angela held out the phone. You need to see this. Caleb took one look at the screen and handed it back. No, it happened to someone else. It always happens to someone else. His voice was flat. That frightened Angela more than anger would have. Caleb, I said no. He walked toward his room. Angela followed. 2 years earlier, Caleb had been an engineering student at Ashwood. He loved machines because broken machines usually revealed what was wrong if a person listened closely enough. People were harder. On October 14th, he bought lunch between 2 laboratory classes. His receipt showed a full meal, a drink, and an extra sandwich he planned to save for the evening. Grace stopped him before he reached the tables. She took the sandwich from his tray. When Caleb showed the receipt, she said the number looked altered. He asked her to scan it. She refused. Then she called security. By the time Angela arrived, Caleb was seated inside a windowless office. Beneath a poster about campus belonging, Grace had written that he attempted to steal food. Caleb's receipt was never added to the report. The school gave him a disciplinary warning. His laboratory supervisor removed him from a student research project because the accusation raised concerns about judgment. Caleb stopped eating on campus. Then he stopped attending class. Months later, he withdrew. Angela wrote letters. She called administrators. She sat in Edward Ashwood's outer office for 4 hours and left with a promise that someone would review the matter. No one called back. For a long time, Angela believed she had failed because she had not used the right words. Now she watched Nadia Bennett use every right word and receive the same contempt. Angela opened the kitchen drawer beside the refrigerator. Under expired coupons and spare batteries lay the accusation letter she had hidden for 2 years. She carried it to Caleb's door. I kept this because I thought one day we might need it. Caleb stared at the paper. You kept it because you couldn't let it go. No, Angela said. I kept it because they wanted us to believe it never happened. By sunset, Angela had contacted Professor Hart. She was not the only one. Former students sent meal receipts, complaint numbers, disciplinary letters, and screenshots. One student remembered Grace marking his account as financial aid after hearing him speak Spanish to his mother. Another said Grace repeatedly told her that fruit cups were reserved for students on premium plans. There was no premium plan. A third described being made to wait beside the counter while white classmates with identical account errors were waved through. The school hired an outside law firm. Marcus insisted on it. He also required the investigators to report directly to an independent committee rather than President Ashwood. Within 48 hours, the Cafeteria transaction system was secured. The data revealed patterns no one could explain as memory or misunderstanding. Over 8 years, Grace had manually adjusted meal access for 87 students. 69 were students of color. 43 had paid for unrestricted plans. 26 had been labeled scholarship recipients despite receiving no dining assistance. Grace had also created internal notes beside certain accounts. Review every purchase. Limit extras, possible misuse, difficult student. None of the labels appeared in official policy. They existed because Grace typed them. The investigation moved beyond the cafeteria. Professor Hart's blue folder contained 14 complaints. The school database showed only 5. Of those 5, 3 had been closed within 24 hours without student interviews. 2 had been assigned to administrators who claimed they never received them. Edward, Ashwood called an emergency staff meeting. We cannot allow one employee's conduct to define this institution, he said. Professor Hart sat near the end of the table. One employee did not delete those complaints. Edward's expression tightened. We do not yet know that anyone deleted them. We know they disappeared. There may have been administrative errors. Errors repeated for 8 years? No one answered. Marcus attended by video. He said little. His legal team had taught him that silence could be useful when others were rushing to fill it. Edward finally turned toward the screen. What would satisfy the Bennett Foundation? Marcus looked at him for several seconds. This is not a negotiation about satisfaction. I mean, what steps would allow us to restore confidence? Start by telling the truth before someone else discovers it for you. Edward looked away. That night, the video passed 22 million views. News vans gathered outside the college gates. Applications were withdrawn. Alumni suspended donations. Students organized a silent lunch protest, filling every table in the cafeteria while leaving the rear section empty. Grace released a statement through an attorney. She denied racial bias. She said the video lacked context and claimed that inconsistent school software had forced her to make difficult decisions. The investigators tested that claim. The software logs told a different story. Each unauthorized change carried a username most belonged to Grace. But several complaints had been altered by an administrative account from the president's office. Dates were moved. Attachments were removed. A complaint filed in 2019 had been changed to show it arrived after the student graduated, allowing the school to mark it closed. Another had been edited the night before Marcus's donation ceremony. The investigators traced the login. It did not belong to Edward Ashwood. It belonged to his chief of staff. But the authorization code used for the changes had been issued from Edward's personal account. When Marcus received the report, he read the final page twice, then he called Nadia. This is no longer only about Grace, he said. Nadia looked down at her black notebook. It never was. The public hearing was held inside Ashwood's oldest auditorium. Every seat was filled. Students stood along the walls. Former graduates crowded the aisles. Reporters waited beneath the balcony, while the board sat behind a long table under the college seal. Grace Colton entered through a side door. She wore a dark suit instead of her cafeteria uniform. Without the apron and gloves, she looked smaller, not harmless, just ordinary. That unsettled Nadia more than she expected. For weeks, Grace had existed in headlines as a symbol of cruelty. Yet the woman taking her seat was not a monster from a story. She was a person who had made the same kind of choice repeatedly until the choice became a system. President Ashwood sat 3 chairs away from her. He had announced his resignation that morning. His statement described failures of oversight, damaged trust, and a need for new leadership. It did not say that he had known enough to ask questions and chosen not to ask them. Professor Hart testified first. She placed the blue folder on the witness table. "I believed preserving these records was responsible," she said. "But records do not protect people when those with authority refuse to read them." One by one, she described the complaints she had submitted. She named the offices that received them. She read the replies. "Thank you for raising this concern. The matter has been addressed. No further action is required." Each sentence sounded polite. Together, they formed a wall. Jordan testified next. He explained why he recorded the confrontation and why he uploaded the video without a caption. "I did not want to tell people what to see," he said. "I wanted them to hear exactly what was said." A board member asked whether public attention had made the investigation more difficult. Jordan considered the question. Public attention made silence more difficult. Angela Ford sat beside Caleb when their names were called. Caleb's hands were clasped so tightly that the knuckles had turned pale. Angela placed the old accusation letter on the table. "My son showed them a receipt," she said. "They decided the accusation mattered more than the proof." Caleb spoke without looking toward Grace. "I left because every hallway felt like people had heard something about me." His voice trembled once. "I started thinking that leaving meant they were right." Angela reached for his hand. Caleb finally looked toward the board. "I was not asking the college to believe I was perfect. I was asking them to check." The auditorium remained quiet. Nadia was called after lunch. She carried her black notebook. Marcus sat in the first row, directly behind her. For most of Nadia's life, his presence had felt like protection. That afternoon, it felt different. Was not there to speak over her. He was there to witness. Nadia opened the notebook. She described the first account error, the separate tables, the altered meal categories. The way Grace lowered her voice when saying the cruelest things, as if calmness could make humiliation professional. Grace L's attorney asked whether Nadia had ever been denied food completely. "Sometimes I received crackers or fruit, so you were fed." Nadia looked at him. "That is not the same as receiving what I paid for." The attorney shifted. Could some of these incidents have been misunderstandings? One incident might be. She turned several pages. 87 account changes are not. Grace stared at the table. When her turn came, she denied acting out of racial prejudice. "I was responsible for controlling waste and misuse," she said. "I had limited staff, unreliable software, and students who frequently challenged rules." The board's counsel displayed the transaction logs. Why were full-paying students marked as scholarship recipients? I made judgment calls. Based on what information? Grace hesitated. Behavior. What behavior? Attitude. Patterns. Suspicious requests. Such as requesting the meal listed in their plan? Grace's face tightened. You were not there. The cafeteria was chaotic. Someone had to maintain order. Nadia studied her. For the first time, she understood Grace's deepest contradiction. Grace believed control was proof of competence. Every student who questioned her became a threat to the identity she had built over 19 years. Admitting one mistake might have meant examining all the others. So she protected herself by making the students seem dishonest. The board's counsel played the cafeteria recording. Grace's voice filled the auditorium. "I did not realize the student was your daughter." Then Marcus's reply. "That should not have mattered." Grace closed her eyes. The sentence followed her because it reduced every defense to one question. Would she have treated Nadia differently if Marcus had been poor? Everyone already knew this answer. Marcus testified last. He did not discuss the market value of his company. He did not describe the influence of his foundation. Instead, he placed Malik's brass token on the table. "My brother gave me this before he died," he said. "He believed I would reach places he never could." Marcus looked toward Nadia. "I spent my life believing my job was to open doors for the people I loved." He paused. "But my daughter taught me that a door opened by one powerful person can close again when that person leaves." He faced the board. "I do not want special treatment for Nadia. I want a system where no student needs a famous parent before someone checks the essence." The board chair asked whether the Bennett Foundation would permanently withdraw its donation. Marcus answered carefully. "The original agreement is finished." A murmur passed through the room. "But the foundation is prepared to consider a new commitment." Edward Ashwood looked up. Marcus continued. "Only if the reforms are binding." He listed them. Independent dining oversight, 20 meal classifications, protected complaint reporting, automatic external review when discrimination was alleged, restitution for affected students, a pathway for those who had withdrawn to return without financial penalty. Grace looked toward him. "You are destroying my life over one mistake." Marcus met her eyes. "No." His voice carried without force. "Your life is changing because you were given many chances to see people clearly."
And you chose not to.
The board recessed before announcing its decision. In the hallway, Marcus stood alone beside a tall window. Nadia approached and opened his hand. She placed the brass token in his palm. "You said Malik wanted it to take you somewhere," she said. Marcus closed his fingers around it. Nadia looked toward the hearing room where Caleb waited with his mother. "Maybe it still can." The doors opened behind them. The board members returned to deliver their judgment. The board returned after 47 minutes. The chair did not look toward the cameras. She looked first at the students, then at Grace Colton. "The findings are unanimous." Grace sat motionless. The chair explained that the school had violated its own policies by failing to investigate repeated complaints, allowing unauthorized meal classifications, and permitting disciplinary actions to continue without proper review. Grace's employment was terminated immediately. The board also referred the unlawful search of Marcus's belongings and the detention of several students to local authorities for further review. President Edward Ashwood's resignation was accepted. His chief of staff was dismissed. An external monitor would oversee the college for 3 years. Students affected by the dining system would receive refunds, disciplinary corrections, and access to independent legal support. Grace stared ahead as each decision was read. When the chair finished, Grace turned toward Nadia. For one brief moment, Nadia thought she might apologize. Instead, Grace said, "You have no idea what it was like trying to keep that place under control." Nadia held her gaze. "No," she replied, "but I know what it was like to be controlled by it." Grace looked away. There was no dramatic outburst, no final speech. She simply gathered her papers and left through the side door while the auditorium remained quiet. That was how 19 years of authority ended, not with applause, with the sound of a door closing behind a woman who had mistaken obedience for respect. The criminal case that followed was narrower than the public expected. Grace was charged in connection with the unauthorized seizure of Marcus's case, unlawful restraint during the cafeteria confrontation, and falsification of institutional records. The court did not place every wound into a single charge. Courts rarely can. But the recordings, transaction logs, and witness testimony established a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as confusion. Grace received a custodial sentence followed by supervised release and a permanent prohibition from holding authority in educational dining or student welfare programs. Several administrators faced civil penalties. The college settled claims with former students. None of it returned the years they had lost. Justice could recognize damage. It could not always restore time. 6 months later, spring rain fell softly across Ashwood's campus. The cafeteria doors opened at 11:30. There were no tables beside the service entrance, no special plates, no invisible categories. A simple sentence had been painted above the dining hall entrance. Every seat belongs to everyone. The new system displayed the same meal options to every student. Account problems were handled privately at a separate support desk. No cafeteria worker could change a student's classification without written authorization and automatic review. Once a month, families were invited to share lunch with students. The first family lunch filled the room beyond capacity. Marcus arrived without assistance. He stood in line with everyone else. The cashier scanned his guest card. "Full meal or soup and sandwich?" "Full meal," he said. Nadia waited near the windows. She had changed since the hearing, not in the obvious ways. She still wore simple sweaters. She still studied late in the library. She still disliked being introduced through her father's accomplishments. But she no longer confused silence with independence. She had become a student representative on the new Equity Council and helped design an anonymous reporting system that sent complaints to both the school and an outside reviewer. Her black notebook was now stored in the college archive, not as a symbol of scandal, as evidence that careful truth, kept long enough, could outlast powerful denial. The Michelle Bennett Student Opportunity Fund reopened under a new agreement. Marcus increased the commitment from $12.5 million to $18 million. Some trustees called the decision generous. Marcus did not. The money funded emergency meals, medical screenings, tuition recovery, and return grants for students who had left because of financial or institutional hardship. The first return grant went to Caleb Ford. He stood outside the cafeteria doors that Friday with Angela beside him. Caleb had re-enrolled in mechanical engineering. His credits were restored. The disciplinary warning had been removed from his record. Still, he could not make himself enter. Angela touched his arm.
"We can go somewhere else."
Caleb looked through the glass. Students moved freely between tables. A worker laughed with a group near the counter. Nothing looked the way he remembered. That did not mean his body had forgotten. Then Nadia appeared inside. She was carrying 2 trays. She opened the door. "I didn't know what you liked," she said, "so I got one of everything I could carry." Caleb stared at the trays. A small laugh escaped him. It was the first sound Angela had heard him make about Ashwood that did not contain pain. Nadia stepped aside. "You can choose the table." Caleb entered. He did not choose the safest seat near the door. He chose the center of the room. Angela watched him sit down and covered her mouth with one hand. Marcus saw her from the lunch line. Their eyes met. Neither needed to speak. Some victories are too large for celebration and too quiet for headlines. They appear as a young man sitting where he once believed he did not belong. Later that afternoon, Marcus and Nadia walked to the new Student Resource Center. A small glass display stood near the entrance. Inside was Malik's worn brass transit token. The inscription beneath it read, One journey can open the way for many. Marcus had resisted putting it there. The token had lived in his pocket for almost 4 decades. Without it, he sometimes reached for the familiar weight and found only fabric. Nadia noticed. Do you miss carrying it? Every day? Then why leave it here? Marcus looked through the glass. Because I think I was carrying the wrong part of it. Nadia waited. I carried the loss, he said. Malik meant for me to carry the journey. Nadia slipped her arm through his for years. Marcus believed love meant preventing every fall. Michelle had understood something he was only beginning to learn. Love was not always standing in front of someone. Sometimes it was standing close enough that they could step forward without being alone. Every Friday after that, Marcus returned to the cafeteria when his schedule allowed. He did not inspect the program. He did not ask for reports. He ate lunch with his daughter. Sometimes they spoke about classes, sometimes about Michelle, sometimes they sat without saying much at all. The school continued changing. Not perfectly. No institution transforms because of one hearing, one donation, or one slogan painted over a doorway, but complaints were answered, records were preserved. Students learned that speaking up did not automatically mean standing alone, and adults who once believed silence kept the peace began to understand what it had actually protected. People like Grace do not remain powerful because they are unstoppable. They remain powerful because those around them decide that speaking is inconvenient, risky, or someone else's responsibility. Professor Hart had kept the records, had kept filming, Angela had kept the letter, Nadia had kept the notebook. Each of them carried one piece of the truth. The truth became powerful only when they stopped carrying it alone. If you believe dignity should never depend on wealth, status, or the name printed on someone's business card, share this with someone who refuses to look away. And tell us in the comments, if you had been standing in that cafeteria, would you have stayed silent or spoken up? Subscribe to Hush Stories for more stories about courage, hidden truth, and the quiet moments that changed lives.